Hey guys, Mr. P here, and this is lecture 3 of chapter 8. And so in past chapters we've talked about redox reactions, and we talked a little bit about ATP production, both chemiosmosis and substrate level phosphorylation. And so finally we've laid all of the foundational items, and we can finally start going into what photosynthesis is and how plants use it to produce ultimately glucose. Okay, so as you probably know, photosynthesis occurs in plants, and not just plants, but there are certain photosynthetic bacteria and photosynthetic protists that will utilize photosynthesis as a way to produce glucose and ultimately produce their own food. We've talked in past chapters about autotrophs, and you know that photoautotrophs are specific autotrophs that are going to use sunlight as an energy source in order to make that glucose. And we've talked about chemoautotrophs being autotrophs that are specifically not using light, they're using chemicals in order to produce that glucose. But photosynthesis occurs in photoautotrophs, it occurs in plants. Most of the time when you think about autotrophs, you're thinking about plants. And these plants, autotrophs, are going to use photosynthesis to produce glucose by ultimately harnessing light energy, specifically photons that are specific particles that are traveling along a specific wavelength that is emitted from the sun, and then used chloroplast or use chlorophyll molecules that are located in these chloroplasts in order to capture that sunlight and then ultimately make it into glucose. Okay, so as a recap, remember photosynthesis as a basic level is a plant using its chloroplast, which is an organelle that contains chlorophyll, to produce glucose by utilizing some reactants like water and CO2. And in a minute we're going to learn about the entire photosynthetic equation, or the entire balanced photosynthetic equation, which includes water, CO2, coming into the plant in the presence of light and chlorophyll to produce glucose, and will also produce a little bit of oxygen as a byproduct. And photosynthesis is a coupling of oxidation-reduction reactions, and it's very similar to cell respiration. And I know in class so far I've made a lot of references to cell respiration. We've even talked about what the cell respiration equation is, and ultimately what happens in cell respiration. We haven't learned about specifics about cell respiration, but we do know that cell respiration is a process that takes place in the mitochondria, and that process specifically takes glucose molecules and converts it to ATP. But these plants have to photosynthesize first, because that is the way in which the plant is going to make glucose. Okay. Photosynthesizer. Yeah. Photosynthetic equation, the balanced photosynthetic equation, I should say. And I know we've talked about it in class, but you have 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O, and I know here is it actually says 12. In class we've used 6, and I'll tell you why we use 6. But 6 CO2 plus 12 H2O yields C6H12O6, which is glucose, plus 6 H2O plus 6 O2. Now, I know you guys are geniuses, and it probably doesn't take a lot of critical brain power or thinking to know why we would say 6H2O over here. And it's just like any chemical equation or any algebraic equation. We just kind of simplify this. And so if we take 6 off of the right side and we take 6 off the left side, we're left with 6. So we just simplified this equation to 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O yields, in the presence of light and chlorophyll, which is really important because this reaction doesn't happen without light, and this reaction doesn't happen even if light is present unless chlorophyll is present, because chlorophyll is ultimately the molecule that's absorbing the light. So 6 carbon dioxides plus 6 waters in the presence of light and chlorophyll yields glucose, 1 molecule of glucose, plus 6 O2. So how many molecules of CO2 does it take to produce 1 molecule of glucose? And if you can read this equation, you would see that it is 6. And why would it take 6 CO2 molecules to make 1 C6 H12O6 molecules? And the answer is you need 6 carbons to produce 1 glucose. And where are we going to get those 6 carbons? Because ultimately water doesn't have carbon. We need 6 carbon dioxide so that we can pull the 6 carbons off of each of those carbon dioxide molecules and then bind them to the H's and O's that come in from the water in order to make glucose. Okay, so 6 CO2s, 6 waters, light chlorophyll produce 1 glucose molecule and will produce 6 oxygen molecules as a byproduct. And oxygen is going to be released to the atmosphere as a byproduct. And we're lucky that plants do produce oxygen as a byproduct, because this oxygen that is produced allows us as heterotrophs, as organisms, to survive. And this entire equation happens in the chloroplast, and there are specific locations within that chloroplast where each of these are going to be produced, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Autotrophs are those organisms that we've already talked about, either photoautotroph or chemoautotrophs, that are called producers, and that's an obvious, it should be fairly obvious why they're called producers. It's because they produce their own food, and they produce food for the entire food chain or the entire food web. What is the food in which they're producing? It's glucose. Okay, they feed themselves glucose, and they feed organisms that eat them glucose. And ultimately, once you have consumed glucose, or once any organism has consumed glucose, cell respiration will kick in, and ATP will be produced by breaking down this glucose molecule. Okay, photosynthesis accounts for all of the chemical energy available for consumption on Earth, and I do mean all. Okay, so where is the ultimate energy source for Earth? The sun. And so the sun is going to send photons, which is a form of energy, to the Earth. That energy will be captured by the chloroplasts, specifically the chlorophyll. And when the chlorophyll captures those photons, it will then use that energy to essentially build glucose. And once that glucose is built, anything that eats producers, and anything that eats anything that eats producers, and anything that eats anything that eats anything that eats producers will all use the glucose that was eventually or originally produced by the producers. So it wouldn't be a Mr. P lecture without a photosynthesis meme. And so if photosynthesis came in different flavors, and if only plants could custom order their meal like you can, this little tree says, "Can I have a bacon cheeseburger? Hold the mayo, please. Extra pickles and curly fries." And the sun says, "Okay, little buddy." And then shines the photons on down, and that plant gets very happy because he got a meal, right? But it doesn't work like that. And so there are specific frequencies that each of the plants or specific frequencies that each of the chlorophyll pigments will absorb, and we'll get to that in a minute. So let's talk a little bit about plant anatomy. There is a cross section right here, and so if we were to take a leaf and cut it in half and then look at the thinness of the leaf, we're not looking at the blade of the leaf, we're not looking at the petiole of the leaf, we're looking at specifically the width of a leaf. And so this up here would be the top, and this down here would be the bottom. So okay, we got our bearings. This is the bottom, and this is the top. Now, there's 3 layers you need to know. The top layer is the cuticle, and the cuticle literally is this tiny little thin layer right on the outside of our epidermis. Okay, so that is the cuticle. The cuticle is just like a thick, waxy, kind of sunscreeny like coat, and it works just like that. It helps produce protection from UV exposure, because unlike you that burns easily in the sun, you can seek shelter, you can seek shade, but these plants can't. And so the plants have adapted and evolved the ability to protect themselves against high durations or long durations of UV exposure. And so they produce this thick, waxy cuticle. And so that's there. If I can change colors here. the epidermis is this layer, okay? And so I'm just kind of like squiggling this in. It's these top cells, okay? It's one layer of cells, and epidermis, just like in your body, is the skin, so to speak, of the plant. And so that is the epidermis. This layer down here would be the epidermis. Now I skipped over that little hole right there because that hole is going to be important. But you have the bottom epidermis and you have the top epidermis. Both of those are like the skin layers within a plant cell. And if I switch it again and I go to the mesophyll is this layer between the two layers of epidermis. So if we go down below the top epidermis and we go above this bottom epidermis, we get this mesophyll layer. Now, of the mesophyll layer, hopefully you can see a distinction basically right through here, where it's much more jam-packed full of cells at the top than it is at the bottom. And there are two distinctions we need to make between the mesophyll. This is the top portion of the mesophyll, which is called the palisade layer. Okay, and the palisade layer is where the majority of the photosynthesis occurs. So this is where all the magic happens, so to speak. This is where the glucose is made. This is where CO2 would be utilized. This is where oxygen would be produced. This is where ultimately the water needs to get to. That is where photosynthesis happens. The spongy layer is down here, which is the really kind of spongy looking cells, right? There's a lot of open spots. And what do you think this structure would be good at doing? And hopefully you came up with the idea that a lot of gas exchange happens right here. Notice that there's a little opening right here, and so gas can get through, and when I say gas I mean O2 and CO2. Gas comes in through these stoma, and stomata allow for gas exchange. Okay, so we're talking about these little stoma. Stoma are openings on the bottom of leaves that allow for O2 to get out and CO2 to get in. And CO2 and O2 will be diffusing into these open spots and then eventually start diffusing into the palisade layer where all of the photosynthesis takes place. Okay, so CO2 is going to diffuse in, come in here, be used in photosynthesis. O2 will be produced as a byproduct, and O2 will diffuse back out. And so there's a kind of a two-way flow of gas coming in and out of this plant through this hole. But cuticle, top epidermis, bottom epidermis, mesophyll, palisade layer, spongy layer. Both of the mesophyll layers have distinct or distinctly different functions. And it's easy to see because they have distinctly different structures as well. Here's a little different picture to look at. You can see more easily because it's a picture and not an actual cross-section or a micrograph of a cross-section. This is your cuticle. It's your thick, waxy coating. Then you have your top epidermis, which is one layer of cells. Then you have your lower epidermis, which is one layer of cells. Then you have your palisade layer, which is where all the photosynthesis happens. You have your spongy mesophyll layer, which is where all the gas exchange happens. And then you have your stomata, where gas actually gets in, or I should say CO2 gets in and O2 gets out, okay, or comes out. Plants do have veins that water will be running through, much like we have veins where our blood goes through. Plants don't have blood, they have water that they need to travel from or transfer from the roots and ground all the way to the top of the trees or leaves. And so you can see all the layers here as well. So let's talk a little bit about plant structure. If we were to look at the entire organism as a whole and look at this leaf and then zoom in a little bit at this cross section here, which is what we were just looking at, you would see that there is a spongy mesophyll layer down here, and there's a palisade layer up in here. You have your upper epidermis, your lower epidermis, your top cuticle, and then you have these stoma or stomates that allow for gas exchange, which you can see right here. CO2 goes in, O2 comes out. H2O can actually transpire out of these stoma as well. But if we zoom into one of these chloroplasts, which is a single organelle within one of these cells, you would see all of these and here we're showing you all the different chloroplasts. But if you zoom in even further to the chloroplasts, which we've done in past chapters, you would see that there are stacks of thylakoids called grana. There's a fluid that surrounds all of these thylakoids or grana inside the inner membrane, and there's thylakoids, which are those single flattened discs. And remember, they're flattened to increase surface area, which is really important because they are in charge of all of the photosynthetic activity. You've got an inner and outer membrane, and then you have this inner membrane space between the two membranes. Okay, so we've talked about all that stuff. Here's the picture a little closer so you can get a better look at it. Notice that when you looked at plant cells under the microscope in lab, you probably saw a bunch of different chloroplasts in the same cell, much like this one. But one distinction that you need to make is that it's not the entire chloroplast that's green, it is actually the individual grana and thylakoids that are green, because they are the only things that contain the chlorophyll. Another meme, man, I must have been feeling generous today. One plant says, "Are you hungry?" And the other plant says, "I could use a light snack." Light snack. You get it. Okay. And the last thing we need to talk about is pigments and the specific chlorophylls. We have chlorophyll A and we have chlorophyll B. You need to know which wavelengths each chlorophyll pigment uses the best. Notice that the red line is chlorophyll A, so we'll start here. It utilizes, and over here is percent absorbed, and we know that if it's absorbing the wavelength, it's using it, and if it's not absorbing it, it's reflecting it. Okay, so this wavelength that we start here in the violet to blue range, which is 400 to 450 nanometers, it's actually going to be absorbed fairly well by chlorophyll A. And then as soon as chlorophyll A dives, which means it can't really utilize much of the blue, it uses the violet. Chlorophyll B comes in here and picks up the slack where chlorophyll A can't. And so together, chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B really pretty well cover the entire violet-blue spectrum until you get to green. Our chlorophylls are going to reflect our green, yellow, orange wavelengths, and as soon as you get to the orange and red, then both chlorophyll B and chlorophyll A start absorbing that wavelength again. So chlorophyll A is in charge of absorbing red and violet. Chlorophyll B is in charge of absorbing blue and red-orange. Okay, so if you have two different chlorophylls and two different chlorophylls are going to focus on or specialize in one specific wavelength or just a small spectrum of this entire visible spectrum, you can see why the plant would want two. Because if the plant only had chlorophyll A, it would only be able to absorb red and violet, and it would not be able to absorb blue, green, yellow, orange, and orange-red, or red-orange. If the chlorophyll only contained, or if the plant can only contain B, chlorophyll B, it's only going to absorb the red-orange and the blue, and it's not going to be able to absorb green, yellow, yellow-orange, red, and violet. And so there are other anthocyanins and carotenoid pigments that are going to be in here, and they're actually going to spike right in here and are going to absorb yellow and orange, which is why you only see plants that are green. And why is it that the plants you look at in your yard or grass or landscaping are green? It's because they're reflecting the green light. They're not absorbing it. All the other pigments are absorbing all the other wavelengths. The only one that is not absorbed is green, and so it is reflected. And anything is the color it is because of the wavelength that it reflects. So I think that's where we'll end it. This one's a little over the 15 minutes that I promised you, but there's a lot of information in here. See ya.